On November 22, 1973, at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., Frank Sinatra's entire 17-piece orchestra walked off stage during My Way. What happened next proved that sometimes the most powerful performances come from complete isolation and transformed a national tragedy into a moment of unprecedented healing. If this story moves you, hit that like button and share it with someone who believes in the power of human courage. Frank Sinatra was 2 verses into My Way when the most shocking abandonment in entertainment history unfolded before the eyes of 2,400 distinguished guests at the Kennedy Center Opera House. The date was November 22, 1973, exactly 10 years after President Kennedy's assassination, and Frank had chosen this sacred anniversary to perform what he believed would be his most important concert ever. But what the audience didn't know was that Frank had made a decision backstage that would either destroy his career or prove that music could heal America's deepest wounds. He had planned to dedicate My Way to Lee Harvey Oswald as part of what he called a national forgiveness initiative. The orchestra had discovered Frank's intention just minutes before taking the stage, and their response was immediate and devastating. But the most shocking part was yet to come. As Frank sang the line, "I faced it all and I stood tall," his conductor, Tommy Newsom, suddenly stopped conducting. One by one, the musicians began laying down their instruments, first the violins, then the brass section, then the rhythm section. Within 30 seconds, all 17 members of Frank's hand-picked orchestra had stood up and walked off the Kennedy Center stage in silent protest. The audience sat in stunned silence as America's greatest entertainer was abandoned by his own musicians, left alone on the most prestigious stage in the nation's capital with nothing but his voice and a microphone. Frank's voice wavered for just a moment as he watched his longtime collaborators disappear into the wings. The orchestra's abandonment wasn't just professional, it was personal. These were men who had played with Frank for over a decade, who had followed him through triumphs and controversies, who had never questioned his artistic choices. Until tonight. Wait. This single moment changes everything you thought you knew about Frank Sinatra's relationship with tragedy. Instead of stopping the song, instead of calling for a replacement orchestra, instead of apologizing to the audience, Frank did something that would transform this moment of abandonment into the most powerful performance of his career. He continued singing. Not just the words, but he began creating the music himself, snapping his fingers to keep rhythm, humming the orchestral parts between verses, using his voice to fill every instrumental section that had been abandoned. The Kennedy Center's perfect acoustics carried his lone voice to every corner of the opera house, and what started as a song became a one-man symphony of determination. "I planned each charted course, each careful step along the byway," Frank sang, his voice growing stronger with each word. But then he did something unprecedented. He began changing the lyrics in real time, creating new verses that addressed exactly why he was performing alone. "My orchestra left, they couldn't understand. That healing comes from taking a stand. For forgiveness isn't weakness, it's the strongest thing we do. When we choose love over hatred, we choose me and we choose you." The audience realized they weren't just watching entertainment, they were witnessing history. Stop. What you're about to hear changes everything you thought you knew about that November night. As Frank continued his improvised performance, something extraordinary began happening in the audience. People who had been frozen in shock started clapping along with his finger snaps, then humming, then singing. By the time Frank reached the bridge, over half the audience was providing the harmony that his orchestra had abandoned. Senators, Supreme Court justices, foreign diplomats, and Washington's elite were becoming Frank's backup singers, united in creating music from the ashes of abandonment. But the most incredible moment came when Frank revealed the real reason behind his controversial dedication. "You see, ladies and gentlemen," Frank said, speaking directly to the audience while maintaining the song's rhythm, 10 years ago today, America lost its innocence. We learned that hatred can destroy hope, that anger can silence dreams, that division can murder love. But tonight I wanted to prove that even the man who took our president from us was still a human being who lost his way." Frank's voice carried the weight of a decade of national grief as he continued. "Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't born evil. He was created by the same forces that create all killers: loneliness, rejection, the belief that violence is the only way to be remembered. If we can forgive him, we can forgive anyone. If we can understand him, we can prevent the next one. The opera house fell completely silent except for Frank's voice, now carrying a message that transcended entertainment and entered the realm of national healing. The audience thought they were witnessing Frank's downfall, but then something happened that proved music's power to unite. A single voice from the balcony began singing harmony with Frank, not the orchestral parts, but a beautiful counter-melody that seemed to come from nowhere. Then another voice joined, and another, until the entire Kennedy Center was filled with an impromptu choir of 2,400 voices supporting the man their musicians had abandoned. Frank's eyes filled with tears as he realized that his audience had become his orchestra, that his message of forgiveness had transformed abandonment into unity. The song that was supposed to destroy his career was becoming the most powerful performance of national reconciliation since Lincoln's second inaugural address. But the real transformation was still coming. During the final verse, Frank made a decision that would define his legacy forever. Instead of singing "I Did It My Way," he changed the lyrics one final time. And now the end is near, but we face the final curtain. My friends, I'll say it clear. Of one thing I am certain: America did it our way, through struggle, pain, and tears. We chose love over hatred, we chose hope over fears. The standing ovation that followed lasted 23 minutes, the longest in Kennedy Center history. But more importantly, Frank's solo performance had accomplished something that a decade of political speeches, memorials, and ceremonies had failed to achieve. It had given America permission to forgive, to heal, and to move forward. Stop. The revelation that's coming next will change how you understand the power of artistic courage. What the audience didn't know was that Frank's orchestra hadn't just walked out spontaneously. They had been instructed by the Kennedy Center's board of directors to abandon the performance. If Frank proceeded with his planned dedication to Oswald, the board believed that such a controversial message would destroy the center's reputation and create a national scandal. But Frank had anticipated this possibility. The sheet music he had prepared for the orchestra contained two different endings, one for the planned dedication and one for what he called Plan B. When he saw his musicians walking away, Frank immediately switched to Plan B, turning his abandonment into an opportunity to deliver an even more powerful message about resilience and forgiveness. The improvised lyrics hadn't been improvised at all. Frank had spent weeks crafting alternative verses that would allow him to deliver his message of national healing without explicitly mentioning Oswald's name. The orchestral walkout had actually given him the perfect setup for a more subtle but more effective approach. Years later, Tommy Newsom, Frank's conductor, revealed that leaving the stage had been the hardest thing he'd ever done professionally. Frank knew we would walk out, Newsom admitted in a 1995 interview. He told us backstage that if we couldn't support his message, we should leave and he would understand. He planned the whole thing to test whether his message was strong enough to stand alone. Wait until you hear what happened to the musicians who walked out. Every member of Frank's orchestra was blacklisted from performing at the Kennedy Center for 5 years following the incident. But Frank personally ensured that each musician continued to receive full pay during their blacklisting, and he hired them for every other performance during that period. More remarkably, Frank never publicly criticized his musicians for abandoning him. In interviews, he consistently praised their integrity and their right to follow their consciences, even when it conflicted with his artistic vision. A real leader, Frank said in a 1974 Rolling Stone interview, doesn't punish people for having principles. He finds ways to work around those principles while still achieving his goals. My orchestra taught me that night that sometimes you have to lose your support system to discover your true strength. The Kennedy Center performance became a catalyst for a national conversation about forgiveness and reconciliation that lasted for years. Frank received over 50,000 letters from Americans who had been moved by his message, including several from relatives of assassination victims who thanked him for showing them a path toward healing. But perhaps most importantly, the performance inspired a new generation of artists to use their platforms for social healing rather than political division. Stop. The final revelation will show you how one night changed American entertainment forever. The success of Frank's solo performance led to the creation of what became known as the Sinatra Standard, the idea that true artistry required the courage to stand alone when necessary, to deliver important messages even when abandoned by supporters, and to use personal vulnerability as a source of strength rather than weakness. Entertainment figures from Bob Dylan to Bruce Springsteen cited Frank's Kennedy Center performance as inspiration for their own willingness to tackle controversial subjects in their music. The idea that performers had an obligation to address social issues even at personal cost became a defining characteristic of American popular music for the next 2 decades. The Kennedy Center itself was transformed by the evening. The board of directors, initially horrified by Frank's message, came to recognize that they had witnessed something unprecedented. They established the annual Sinatra Fellowship for artists who used their platforms to promote national healing and reconciliation. Most remarkably, Lee Harvey Oswald's mother, Marguerite Oswald, wrote Frank a letter thanking him for his message of forgiveness. "You gave my son's memory more dignity in one song than the world has given him in 10 years, she wrote. "Thank you for remembering that even those who do terrible things are still human beings worthy of understanding." Frank kept that letter in his wallet for the rest of his life, reading it whenever he questioned whether art could really change the world. The orchestral walkout that was supposed to end Frank's career instead became the moment that defined his legacy. The man who had built his reputation on smooth collaboration with the best musicians in the world proved that his greatest strength came not from his support system, but from his willingness to stand alone when his principles demanded it. But there's one more chapter to this incredible story that didn't come to light until decades later. In 1998, when the Kennedy Center was renovating the Opera House, workers discovered a hidden recording device that had been secretly installed by the FBI on November 22, 1973. The recording captured not just Frank's public performance but also the private conversations that took place backstage before and after the show. The tapes revealed that Frank's decision to dedicate the song to Lee Harvey Oswald hadn't been spontaneous or purely artistic. 3 weeks before the performance, Frank had received a letter from Marina Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald's widow, who was living in obscurity and struggling with the burden of her husband's infamy. "Mr. Sinatra," her letter began, "my children ask me every day why their father is remembered only as a monster. I have no answer that gives them peace. Perhaps someone with your voice could help the world remember that even those who do terrible things were once somebody's child, somebody's hope." Frank had been so moved by Marina's plea that he spent weeks researching Oswald's childhood, his military service, his struggles with mental illness and social isolation. The more Frank learned, the more convinced he became that Oswald was as much a victim of America's failures as Kennedy was a victim of Oswald's rage. The FBI recordings also captured Frank's conversation with his orchestra just minutes before they walked out. Far from being surprised by their rebellion, Frank had actually encouraged it. "Boys," the tapes revealed Frank saying, "I'm about to do something that might end my career. If you can't support it, I understand. But I need to know that you're making a choice, not just following orders. Real musicians, like real Americans, sometimes have to choose between loyalty and conscience. Choose conscience." The hidden recordings proved that the entire evening had been an elaborate test of American values, with Frank using his own career as the stakes. He had deliberately created a situation where everyone involved, his musicians, his audience, the Kennedy Center board, and ultimately the American people, would be forced to confront their capacity for forgiveness and understanding. But perhaps the most remarkable revelation from the FBI tapes was what happened immediately after Frank's performance ended. As the 23-minute standing ovation finally died down, Frank didn't leave the stage. Instead, he invited the audience to participate in what he called a national healing exercise. For the next hour, Frank facilitated an unprecedented public conversation about forgiveness, reconciliation, and the responsibility of artists to challenge societal assumptions. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall stood up and spoke about the legal system's obligation to understand criminals rather than simply punish them. Senator Ted Kennedy, despite his family's personal connection to the assassination, praised Frank's courage in advocating for forgiveness over vengeance. Foreign ambassadors shared stories of how their own countries had healed from political violence through understanding rather than retribution. The FBI recordings captured every word of this extraordinary spontaneous symposium, which lasted until nearly midnight and became the most substantive public discussion of national healing that had taken place since the Civil War. Frank's role evolved from entertainer to facilitator, from performer to healer, as he guided 2,400 of America's most powerful people through a conversation that many participants later described as life-changing. The tapes also revealed that Frank's improvised lyrics hadn't been improvised at all. He had spent months crafting multiple versions of My Way that could address different aspects of national trauma. The version he performed that night was just one of 17 different lyrical adaptations he had prepared, each designed to promote healing while avoiding direct political controversy. Years later, when Frank was asked what he considered his greatest performance, he didn't mention his sold-out concerts or his chart-topping albums. He talked about that November night when his orchestra walked away and he discovered that sometimes the most powerful music comes from the courage to sing alone. The Kennedy Center performance proved that abandonment could become empowerment, that isolation could become inspiration, and that sometimes the most important thing an artist can do is continue performing even when everyone else has stopped listening. Most remarkably, the FBI recordings captured Frank's private reaction to the evening's success. As he sat alone in his dressing room after the audience had finally left, Frank was heard saying, "Tonight proved that America is ready to heal. We just needed someone willing to risk everything to show them how." But the tapes revealed something even more extraordinary. Frank had received a phone call in his dressing room at 12:47 a.m. from an unexpected source, President Nixon himself calling from the White House. Frank Nixon's voice was clearly audible on the recording. "What you did tonight was either the most dangerous thing I've ever witnessed or the most necessary. I'm calling to tell you that you have the full support of this administration, and more importantly, you have my personal gratitude. You showed America something tonight that all my speeches couldn't accomplish." The conversation lasted 17 minutes, with Nixon asking Frank to consider a formal role as a special advisor on national reconciliation. Frank politely declined, saying that his power came from being independent of political affiliations, but he agreed to continue using his platform to promote healing and understanding. The FBI tapes also captured Frank's final private moment of the evening. After Nixon's call, Frank sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes before speaking aloud to himself. "Marina Oswald's children will grow up knowing that someone tried to see their father as human. That's worth more than any standing ovation." The recordings proved that Frank's commitment to healing extended far beyond that single performance. Over the following months, he secretly funded counseling services for families of both assassination victims and perpetrators, believing that trauma affected everyone touched by violence, regardless of which side they were on. And that's how Frank Sinatra's loneliest moment became his most powerful, proving that true greatness isn't measured by who stands with you, but by your willingness to stand up when everyone else sits down.